Alright, in this video I'm going to walk you through the installation instructions for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit on the 2019 and newer Kawasaki ZX-6R. Before we get into the installation procedure, I just want to go over some of the key details of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit for the ZX-6R. Now this is designed specifically for the latest generation, so 2019 and newer Ninja ZX-6R from Kawasaki. It's going to be set up to sit perfectly in the pocket removed that's left behind on the undertail from the factory or fender. So it's got a kind of specific shape to it. Wiring is going to go directly into the undertail of the motorcycle, and then if you kind of look at it from an angle, you'll see that we bring the side flanges up right to the level of the body line of the motorcycle, and so that's going to make a super flush final fitment. Just like most Vagabond Fender Eliminators, CNC laser cut, CNC formed from 5052 series aluminum. It's going to be powder coated in a UV resistant satin black powder coat for a very durable and kind of OEM grade finish. It's going to be set up as a complete plug and play installation for the OEM lights. So DOT certification on all your lights is maintained, both for the turn signals and the license plate light. Some of the other things that Vagabond does is include rubber bumpers on the license plate flange to minimize buzzing of the license plate, and we also include a rubber grommet in this kind of oval slot, and that's going to really kind of grip the cable looms on the way into the undertail, as well as prevent like road grime from making its way into the underside of your motorcycle. Vagabond kit is also includes 4 machined aluminum spacers. So that's going to go in between the fender limiter and the body of the motorcycle to kind of make a nice rigid connection, so you're not really squeezing your plastics and potentially cracking them. And then 4 locking nuts, and so that's going to allow this style of construction, which has pressed in studs as opposed to loose screws, to very simply kind of stack your spacers on top of them for a very quick installation, as opposed to kind of fumbling around with a bunch of loose hardware. Vagabond kit is proudly made here in the USA, and we kind of see this as like the most OEM grade kit on the market in terms of providing you with an extremely clean final appearance of the installed product. Now, as for tools you'll need for the installation process, you'll need a 5mm Allen key, Phillips head screwdriver, and an 8 and a 10mm socket. And it is going to be required that you either have a deep socket or an extension on your socket. This process, I am going to be using a power driver to make things a little bit easier or faster, but you don't necessarily have to do that. 2 tools that, if you do have them, get them out. If you don't have them, it's okay, you can survive without them for this process. It's going to be a very small flathead screwdriver to help with some electrical connectors, and a right angle screwdriver of some Phillips head screwdriver of some fashion. Again, those are not required, but will make the process a little easier. Well, the first step in the process is going to be to remove the factory or fender for disassembly. You're going to start by taking your key in the slot under the tail section of the motorcycle, and not remove the passenger seat, but remove the rider's seat. So that's something that's a little bit different on this generation ZX-6R. Now you're going to take this little cable barrel and just pull on it down, and that's going to release the latch for the passenger seat. So remove the passenger seat and set that aside as well. And if you kind of peek under this, I think this is the exhaust valve motor, you'll see that the 4 bolts that hold on the factory or fender are actually underneath this kind of motor assembly. And we don't have to take it all apart, but we are going to take the motor off of its frame mount so that we can just move it to the side. We don't actually have to disconnect the cables or anything like that. But what we want to be able to do is just kind of scoot it over. So we're going to end up kind of moving this whole motor to the side, but before we do that, we're going to open up this cable clamp and disconnect a bunch of cable connectors, or electrical connectors. And so this is, you can just use your fingernail and pry this black plastic reusable cable clip open, and that's going to start to get this whole loom of cables kind of loose. And so you can roll this black plastic boot back, and you're going to see essentially the ones with the blue, the electrical looms with the blue jacket are specifically for this exhaust valve, and it's, like I said, it's going to be easier if you go ahead and remove them all. So these tabs, you can either push down on the tab you remove, or you can use a little flathead screwdriver to help you. And that's kind of true on both of these, where technically you can push hard enough with your thumb to release it, but sometimes that's actually fairly tight, so you can take a very small flathead screwdriver and just help you pick that tab up. That's what I like to do. It's a lot more gentle. So go ahead and disconnect all 5. Obviously only 3 are going to be for the factory or fender. Those are going to be the 2 little 2-pin connectors, and then you are going to have a 2-pin for the license plate light. But once you've got this whole assemblage of connectors free, all we want to do is kind of pick up this motor and bring it to the side, and that's going to give you access down into these 4 bolts. So don't otherwise disconnect anything on the exhaust motor. It's just going to make this process simpler to kind of pull it away and then put it right back. So now you can move this motor to the side a little bit. I'd always recommend putting like a little cloth or a paper towel down so you don't risk scratching your exterior plastics up during this process. So just let it sit there. If you move the boot to the side or tuck it away, you'll see there are 4. You'll see our 3 connectors that are going through this kind of rectangular hole down into the factory fender. You're going to start with the 2 Phillips. Kawasaki has a habit of putting both a plastic to plastic screw, which are these Phillips, and the primary structural screws, which are that 4-bolt pattern of 5mm Allen keys. So I'd always recommend start with the plastic screws. So start with the Phillips, remove those, and then grab your 5mm Allen key and remove these 4 button head screws. Now you can get away with removing one at a time, but just so you don't bind up one, I'd always recommend loosening them all a little bit, just because Kawasaki has a habit of putting really hard Loctite on these. So the only other thing I would recommend is when you do get down to this 4th bolt, hold the fender with your other hand so that it doesn't fall. You can kind of just jiggle those connectors out, and we'll put this fender on the bench and break it down. Once you've got the factory fender off your motorcycle, go ahead and start by taking the license plate off. Every dealer is probably going to supply slightly different hardware. In the case of Fun Bike, it's going to be Phillips head screws and either 11mm or 7/16 hex nuts on the back. Once you've got the fender license plate off, this fender is super easy to split in half. 2 Phillips head screws kind of in little pockets, and then 1 8mm kind of hiding back here. I'll start with the 8mm just because you don't want that to be the last thing holding your fender together. And you're not going to reuse this hardware. You can pull that reflector that's connected with 8mm. Not going to reuse this hardware, but what I like to do is put everything back together, because it makes it super easy to store if you ever want to go back to stock. So go ahead and pop these 2 Phillips screws, and then your fender is going to split in half. Next up is we're going to take the OEM turn signals out of the factory fender. So with the Phillips head screwdriver, just push pretty hard when you're taking these little central Phillips out, because they can be kind of tight from Kawasaki. So once you take that Phillips out, there's going to be a retaining plate. Keep all this hardware, and then use your screwdriver to pry out this internal nut plate. And so that's got a threaded insert in it that helps keep everything together. So you can slide that off the wiring loom, and then there's a little scallop taken out of the rubber boot, which just helps kind of tell you which way to pull this turn signal out, to kind of grasp by the clear lens and rotate rearward, and you can pop the turn signal out. So once we've done that on the left, we will quickly do that again on the right before we take off the license plate light. And so because you can get directly at that screw, you shouldn't have to worry about stripping these screws out, but take a little bit of care when you're doing that. Again, nut plate, slide it off, rotate it back. Okay, now to get the turn signal off, or sorry, the license plate light off, excuse me, it's actually a little bit trickier, but there's just two Phillips head screws. We're going to keep all the hardware out of this little grommet stack here. You can use power driver for kind of one of them, and that underneath each screw there's going to be a washer, and then you're going to take this grommet out as well. But there is probably the one challenging part of this disassembly is the other screw is kind of at an angle, and so you should still have enough access with a standard screwdriver. Kind of come at it from hopefully not too big of an angle. It's kind of a pain in the butt, but the other options here will be like a right angle screwdriver if you really want to, but because it's a plastic thread cutting screw, it doesn't really like release. It just is tight the whole way out. So once you have the license plate light out, set all your hardware aside here, but you are going to keep these two bushings. So go ahead and slide one out and pull the other one out, and then you can set your factory fender aside. So once you've got all the lights out of your factory or fender, you should kind of end up with this setup where you've got Fender Eliminator ready to reload all the lights into, license plate light, two screws, two factory washers, two grommets, and then you got both your turn signals, and for each turn signal you have the nut plate, the internal nut plate, the kind of retaining plate, and then the two small screws. And so let's go ahead and start the assembly of the lights onto the Fender Eliminator. I would recommend beginning with the license plate light, and all you're going to do is take those grommets and kind of jam them into the squared off holes, the kind of D-shaped cutouts in the left and right holes of the Fender Eliminator by the license plate light. Now those don't have to be like perfectly clocked, but just kind of put the cutout, the vertical trimmed section towards the center. And so keeping this grommet is going to keep kind of vibration down on this light, but it should be a very nice tight fit, and so it's not going to kind of wobble about like it does on the factory motorcycle. So once you've got the two grommets in, go ahead and load the connector. I just go straight through both holes on the Fender Eliminator, the first round one and then the oval slot, and then you're going to go and with both a washer and that OEM screw. I'll just start them by hand. Go ahead and sink your screws in. And so one of the things you'll notice here is it's a little easier to do this before you load the turn signals in. So although I think you technically can do it any way you want, I'd recommend starting with the license plate light. So once that's installed, you can kind of see it's got a pretty nice fit to it. It'll have some give, but it's not going to kind of vibrate that much. Like if you feel the factory fender, it's like terribly loose in there. So once your license plate light is in, we'll go ahead and move to the turn signals. Now, they are fairly easy to tell what direction is which. For example, the left is going to be the gray connector, the right is going to be the black, but you'll always be able to read the text on the lens to kind of help you point which direction you got to go. In terms of how these install, they kind of go just the way, it's the opposite of how you yank them out of the factory fender. and that is thread the connector through and then take the grooved part of that kind of rubber gasket or boot at the base of the turn signal and kind of load it into this rearward groove here, and then you're just going to kind of crank the whole assembly inward. So it's really important that you start with a good fit before you start at the base of this groove before you go too much further in terms of kind of cramming it in. Otherwise you're just going to be rather unsuccessful. So once you've got it clipped into the boot, the groove there, load the washer, kind of the nut plate, onto the cable loom. The way that I install these is you kind of, at the end of the day, you're just pushing it down into under the little 4 tabs. There we go. So what you're going to end up with is that nut plate being retained under its rubber boot. Then you're going to take the retaining plate and the screws, one of the screws, and the first one you install is going to be really easy because you can come at it with a screwdriver from this direction, kind of through the opposing turn signal's hole. Go ahead and tighten that up, and then we'll move on to the other side. The left turn signal is going to go exactly the same. Start with the cable loom through that kind of interesting shaped cutout, and then seat the called the forward section of the groove, and I said that's kind of the most important part. It's getting it seated, and you kind of have to wobble it back a bit, and then you pop it through. And again, once you've got the turn signal into the body of the Fender Eliminator, probably the trickiest part of this install, or this process, this part of the install anyways, is getting these silly little retainer plates back in, especially this last one where your access is kind of limited. But it does pay to start with the base. There we go. And then just the base properly seated under 2 of the little rubber tangs, and then you can move on to the cover plate. Now when we get to the cover plate, there's 2 options. You can either, hopefully you guys can see well enough here, start that screw by hand. So your 2 options are going to be as follows. You can either take your Phillips head screwdriver and very carefully come at it from an angle, and that works. That'd be great if I actually started the I said I was going to start the thread by hand. So you can come at it from an angle and screw this in. The thing that is very critical is that you don't kind of grind the screwdriver into this flange, because you will rub the powder coat right off the aluminum. So if you do have a right angle screwdriver, and these are super cheap, super convenient tool to have, they will prevent any of that kind of potential either screw stripping or damage to your Fender Eliminator during this phase to occur. And I like to use these to set an equal torque on both your turn signal screws at this point, but you are essentially ready to just button up the wiring at this point once you've got both turn signals and the license plate light in there. Now to button up the wiring for this, all you're going to do is push both of your turn signal looms through that same oval hole that the license plate light electrical loom is through already, and then you're going to take the grommet, you can kind of flip it over at this point, you're going to take the grommet that is supplied and start it over kind of the worst offender, which is the white 2-pin connector for the license plate light. So kind of jam that one through. If you start with the other ones, it's just going to leave less room for this one, which is the largest of the three by quite some margin. So it's actually not that difficult. I'm making it look much harder than it is. Just thread them through, and at this point what you can kind of do is kind of keep an eye on how you want the cables to leave the fender eliminator. Ideally you'll have them kind of 3 in a row: turn signal, license plate light, turn signal. And so you kind of keep that in mind as you're working this grommet down. It'll make things a little simpler when you get down to the last step. So the process for installing the grommet is not a particularly glamorous one, but you essentially there's a groove in the grommet, and you're going to want to, kind of like the turn signals, you're going to want to seat it and then kind of work your way around. And so just pick any one direction, and there is plenty of space in this grommet, call it gland, or the hole size. So it shouldn't be particularly challenging, but there's not like a magic way to, except for kind of shove it in there. Except all you want to do is kind of look at the backside and make sure there's not like a wrinkle, and it'll be pretty clear if there is. Once that's in place, like I kind of mentioned, you have at least some opportunity to kind of tidy up how they leave that spot. But you can see there's a little bit of wire resistance, so that you don't need to like zip tie this separately, and then you'll end up with your tune turn signals and your license plate light kind of cleanly exiting the fender eliminator into the tail section of the motorcycle, and like there's no vibration that's gonna like eventually chafe through those looms. So once we're at this fully assembled state, the fender eliminator is ready to go onto the motorcycle, and so your wire's ready to go, all your fasteners are tight. The only thing to talk about here is we supply the kit with 4 of these spacers, these nice machined aluminum spacers, and all you got to do is slide one on top of each of the studs. And what that's going to do is allow us to space ourselves appropriately from that little pocket in the tail section of the motorcycle, so that we have lots of room for the wires to exit cleanly, and that we kind of tighten up to the body line perfectly. And so put one spacer on each of the studs, and then we're just going to go kind of line everything up on the motorcycle and put those 4 locking nuts on top of these studs. Now you take your fender eliminator over to the motorcycle. Just start with your license plate light connector, because this is going to be the longest, but then feed up your turn signal connectors as well. Grab them from the top to just get them out of the way, and then you can kind of from the top eyeball your 4 studs in the 4 holes and bring it right on up, and it should kind of bottom right out on those spacers. And then with your other hand, you don't have to I like these K-locks, because the locking features on the conical washer that's captured as part of that nut, and so you can spin them by hand all the way down. There's not like a nylock where you have to kind of push through the locking element. So go ahead and get all 4 of the nuts on. If you happen to drop one of these, they are magnetic, so you can take like a little one of those magnetic ones and pull them back out from the recesses of the tail section. Once you've got all 4 on, you take your 10mm wrench, and don't go crazy tight on one right off the bat, but you can kind of work your way around. And then I would always recommend a final torque with a wrench, not a power driver. Just because you risk really over tightening something if you do that. So thankfully it's just a fender eliminator, so it's not a structural component of the motorcycle, but in some version of a torquing sequence. So just don't go crazy tight on one fastener and then walk away. Give yourself some time to just kind of step yourself around. Doesn't have to be a cross pattern, but go and tighten those screws. And then, I guess before you tighten them, make sure you're kind of straight on the motorcycle. But what you'll end up with is you can feel like this thing is just like rock solid on here. So you can see we've got our 4 locking nuts tightened down. There's plenty of space above these studs
for the exhaust, I guess, valve motor. And so go ahead and place that. We're essentially just going to start reversing a lot of the steps we had previously performed in terms of reassembly. So just make sure you keep your wiring looms kind of out of the way, but place that motor back into position. Take your two kind of bright zinc plated screws. These are going to be 10mm hex heads, and get them started by hand. These are also magnetic, so if you drop one of these, you can fish it out with a magnet as well. Grab your 10mm wrench. So make sure you're kind of notionally the same place you were when you took it off. Tighten these up. We'll move on to wiring. So if you recall, you kind of rolled this boot forward, but you can roll it back again. And you've got the 3 connectors that you were just tinkering with on the Fender, and then the 2 connectors for this exhaust valve motor. And so thankfully they're all unique, so you can kind of start however you would like. Try not to get them all wrapped up around each other, but there's the 3-pin and the 2-pin for this kind of cable drive, and then you've got all the ones for the Fender, and they all match. So license plate light's going to be this nice sealed 2-pin connector, the white body, and then your turn signals are going to be these gray and black 2-pin connectors. So first step is going to be reconnect everything, and for better or worse on this motorcycle there isn't, you'll see we've got a little bit more wire than we used to, or I guess loom than we used to, because obviously we've shortened the fender assembly rather dramatically. But what we don't want to do right now, because the next step is going to be get this boot back over, and then if you can recall, we have this reusable cable clamp, and we are definitely going to try to put it back to the same place. So kind of just try to jam that loom back under the cable clamp, and it's just one of those push to close. You'll hear it click a few times, and that means everything is where it belongs. Now the only thing you have to do at this point is loop your cables, and there actually is more space kind of under this crossbar, and so gently I would recommend slowly kind of feeding your extra fender loom that direction. I mean, realistically what you're trying to achieve with this is a kind of stable wiring kind of placement, so that it's not kind of bound up in a ball. And so what you really want to get to is something that looks nice and clean and is a kind of factory as it was when it came from the factory. Once you've completed the wiring, I do recommend doing a quick system check. Make sure your turn signals are going the direction they should. You can see the license plate light's working. Always do a quick brake light check just to make sure that you haven't tinkered with any of the wiring down there, and then you are ready to go. So installation on your seats is pretty straightforward. Start with your rear kind of passenger seat, slide the 2 teeth in, clip it in place, and then the primary seat has just got a tab that you want to put under the front frame, right, or little catch. So slide it forward and then line up its catch, and you're done. Now with that, the installation of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator is complete. Give you a couple extra kind of walk around views. You can get a feel for like how the Fender Eliminator fits to the underside of the motorcycle. You can tell there's like very minimal gaps. Everything fits the body lines of the motorcycle super well. Give you some underside views so you can kind of get a feel for the wiring tidiness and how that looks.
Thank you for watching this video. Our products can be found direct on our website, www.vagabondmotorsports.com. You can also find us on Amazon for Prime members and eBay. Thank you.